Hello and welcome. We are together for the LGBTQ plus rights global to local today, being sponsored by the United Nations Association with help from the National LGBTQ Task Force, as well as SMYAL here in the district and serving Virginia and Maryland. We're very glad that you're with us. We've got actually a dynamic collection of speakers today who really will be able to bring to you the very best from the global to the local. Let me tell you a moment, just take a moment to tell you about the United Nations Association. We include advocacy, outreach, education, and networking, really bringing people together from the DMV, District of Columbia, Maryland, and Northern Virginia, to talk about the United Nations and put leverage on policyholders to ensure that, in fact, the United States engagement in the United Nations is as robust as possible. Also, to learn from the United Nations, because clearly there's much happening across the globe that Americans can benefit from. We have a big investment in young people, whether it is through our young professionals programs, our graduate fellows programs, advocacy fellows, as well as in our program that focuses on global classrooms, the Model UN, which serves middle school and high school students. All right, so it's June 1st. We are just emerging from a holiday weekend. There is a buzz of cicadas going on, depending on where you are. And we're beginning to shed our masks. It's the beginning of Pride. Pride that will be celebrated in many cities across the United States during this month and in many other places across the calendar year. So we're going to be talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, a good umbrella term, plus. And what we know is that with LGBTQ issues, it's not just those people who self-identify and say, I am, this is me, but in fact, all of our families, our coworkers, our friends, our peers, and other students too. So that in fact, it's a comprehensive we when it comes to LGBTQ issues. You know, I want you to consider this. You know, we have been taking in and observing actions of authoritarian governments impacting travel across Europe. The Suez Canal blocked by a supertanker, a contagious and deadly virus with disparate access to vaccines worldwide. Racial justice through Black Lives Matter, gender justice through the Me Too movement, and a teenager striking for climate at the Stockholm Parliament. All of these individual pieces ended up having global impact. Our lives are truly interdependent. I often think about Martin Luther King and his letter from the Birmingham jail, and I'm going to briefly read it to you. I recognize, I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So this is it. We're in this together. And with this, we're going to be talking about LGBTQ rights in the framework today of youth and how it relates to sustainable development goals, and specifically 5 goals that I'll introduce in just a minute. But let me first begin by greeting our speakers. I'll be doing in-depth introductions as each one of them speaks, but let's begin. Our keynoter is Victor Marigra Borlos. He's the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, on protection of violence and discrimination. Victor was appointed by the UN system as the independent expert in 2017. He began his first term in 2018. He has just been renewed for this next term. He is a Costa Rican jurist and a senior visiting researcher at Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program. He's in residence through 2023 at the Harvard Law School. Victor, we're so very, very glad that you're with us today. We'll also be hearing from Ms. Monet Umana. Monet is a firm believer that the root of everything should be a reference to Black life. She's a recent college graduate, and she works as, in fact, an organizer, as, in fact, a fellow with SMYAL. And SMYAL does tremendous work across Washington, D.C., some in Virginia, and in Montgomery County, Maryland, addressing needs of young people who are LGBTQ. Zach Kong, he is a high school student for one more day. And in that, he is from Howard County, Maryland. Zach takes on other responsibilities in leadership on LGBTQ issues, as well as in leading the education process, public education process. We'll get to him in just a little bit. And lastly, we're very pleased to be able to have the executive director of the National LGBTQ Task Force, Kiera Johnson, with us today. Kiera is fairly new in her job, but deeply grounded in who she is and what she can do in order to make things better for LGBTQ plus people. And so Kiera, we're so glad that you're here, that you are in this movement. I know in the past you worked within the reproductive rights movement. We're glad to have you with us today. So we're going to be talking about LGBTQ, and we'll also reference, there's an alphabet soup with everything that you do. So we'll be also referencing SOGI. So to go back, LGBTQ, for those who are not familiar, lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, Q as in queer, questioning, and plus, to include variables such as asexual, also then as far as intersexual, and then also pansexual. With that, SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity. Today, actually, I have a friend here locally who's a teacher. She's a high school teacher. And she told me over the weekend she has a student who will be coming out as transgender today. That student, who has been until now within this school year online and now 2 days a week in person as female, will transition today and asking peers to refer to the person as a he. That is gender identity, and a huge step to be taking. And we'll be talking about trans youth as well as in all the other identities as we move along. But we're also going to be talking about the SDGs, a whole nother alphabet soup, Sustainable Development Goals. These are goals that were established by the United Nations and the nations of the world, really with tremendous work and advocacy. In my own experience, it was actually education, where I was putting in a lot of work because early on it didn't appear that there was going to be a goal on education. There are 17 goals that span experience. And in 2015 and just prior, there was a lot of negotiations within the United Nations and amongst civil society. That's nonprofit organizations, that's businesses, that's education unions and other unions, about what those global goals should be. And they were negotiated and established. 2030 is when, in fact, these goals hopefully will be accomplished. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 goals. Number 1, goal 1, poverty, no poverty. Goal 3, which is good health and well-being. Goal 4, the one I know very well, quality education. Goal 5, gender equality, one I've also worked on. And SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is reduced inequalities, which will include then inequalities based on race and racism, national origin issues, religious, whether it's Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other biases based on religion, and other variables. So what we're going to do today is have this discussion on LGBTQ youth, but then bring in these SDGs, talking about them both from that global level to then what that means out on the street. Where does it fit? So very, very glad that we've got this going on. And we'll begin then with an introduction. Victor Marigra Borlos, again, is the independent expert on the protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. He was appointed in 2017 by the United Nations Human Rights Council. And in this, in fact, then is in now his second term. In that capacity, he implements international human rights law, raises awareness, engages in dialogue with relevant stakeholders, and provides advisory services, technical assistance, and capacity building to reduce violence and discrimination against people who are LGBTQ. Victor is Costa Rican. He's a visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program. And with that, he's worked also then with the International Rehabilitation Council of Torture Victims, a global network of 150 rehab centers around the world with the vision that all people deserve the full engagement and access to their human rights. He was a member of the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture from 2013 to 2016. And he was the rapporteur on reprisals and oversaw draft policy on torture and ill treatment of LGBTI people. Victor Borlos, Marigra Borlos, is a founding member of the Costa Rican Association of International Law and a founding member of the board of the International Justice Resource Center and founding member of Synergia IDH. Victor, we're so very glad that you were able to make time today. I'll let everyone know that he is working in the early evening because he is in Geneva, Switzerland, the home of the Human Rights Council. Victor, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jill. And I want to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill. And I want to extend my warm thanks to the United Nations Association and the task force, and as well to SMYAL. I'm delighted to getting to know these organizations better as I go along, and to increase the knowledge that I have already of the United Nations Association, for which I have great admiration, and for the mission of which I have great, very much support, because I actually think that expanding knowledge about the objectives and the mission of the UN is one of the fundamental elements that it's going to ensure the continued relevance of the United Nations all throughout the world. I was very much delighted by this invitation, and thank you very much for it.
Absolutely. Why don't we begin by talking about what it means to be a human rights independent expert within the UN system? What are some of those responsibilities that you do on behalf of LGBTI people? Well,
special procedures of the Human Rights Council, they have been called the eyes and ears of the Human Rights Council. Historically, they had their origin in the need of the Human Rights Council's predecessor to investigate in depth situations of deep concern in relation to human rights, namely South Africa and Chile, and the need to create a very specific body of expertise that would look into these situations and would then report to the human rights body of the United Nations in a manner that was objective and independent and also competent. Those were the very first special procedures. Over time, they have grown to some 54 special procedures between working groups, special rapporteurs, or independent experts. What is particular about each one of these bodies is that we each have one point of entry into understanding lived experiences of violence and discrimination. It might be, in some cases, that the mandate will be focusing on torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, or it will be the mandate on violence against women, or in the case of my particular mandate, that it will focus on persons who suffer violence and discrimination because of their real or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity. What the creation of the mandate signals is a conviction of the international community that that particular identity is a necessary point of entry into the analysis of violence and discrimination that is suffered by many people around the world every day. One last idea in this connection. We all understand that this is not the only point of analysis, that every identity intersects with others. As one scholar from the Global South said to me in my first round of hearings, we all reunite many identities in one body. And therefore, the experience and analytical eye of every mandate holder is by its very nature intersectional. But what we have is we have a point of departure and a narrative to express our types of analysis.
I'm so glad you were able to address intersectionality as far as that it really ties together. And I know recently you worked on a statement with many, many other human rights special rapporteurs and officials. Can you tell us what that statement was about?
Well, it was a historic statement for 17 May. I'm so glad that you bring it up because it actually was something that I'm very proud of. I joined 114 experts at global and regional level in making a call for political and religious leaders to carefully consider the impact of narratives and discourses of exclusion. And particularly making reference to the fact that in our conviction, the right to freedom of religion and belief and the right to live free from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity are completely coherent and mutually reinforcing. We are concerned, a great number of my colleagues and I, of a particular line of narrative that appears to have gained traction over the last few years that seems to proclaim that there are things that are antagonistic between the right of LGBT persons to live free and equal and the right to freedom of religion and belief. And that statement had the purpose of bringing the technical elements of analysis within a human rights-based approach to clarify that there is absolutely nothing that is antagonistic in this set of values. I was very proud to spearhead that statement with my colleague, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, Ahmed Shahid, and to be joined by not only treaty bodies, members, special rapporteurs, and independent experts, but the full Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the European Commissioner on Human Rights, on what is a historic statement on this harmony that exists between these values and rights. Important in that statement as well, that we wanted to bring very much to the forefront, is a very cruel violation that I have been witnessing since day one that I exercise in my mandate, and is not very much talked about. and is the stigma that is attached to LGBT people everywhere around the world, and that tends to rely on the narrative that LGBT people are somehow immoral in their nature, and therefore that they're not having the capacity of being spiritual beings. There appears to be a narrative that claims that there is something contrary in living free and equal as a lesbian or a gay, trans, bisexual, or gender diverse person, and of being a spiritual person. And the statement goes quite some way in expressing our view that many people choose in spirituality one of the ways in which they seek happiness and fulfillment in life. And that denial of that trait, that fundamental tool for many people, is something that is not at all protected under human rights-based narratives.
Thank you very much. Yeah, within many religions, certainly, religion has been used as the weapon against LGBT people rather than, in fact, an acknowledgement and embracing of love, which again, love being a core element of religion. So thank you. As I read through your 2-year plan, which is on your website, of what you intend to do as an independent expert, it included too then many different topics that you will be looking into and researching. One of those is colonialism. And often when I think about this religion thing and using religion as a sword or a hammer or a bomb, I think of it as far as religion also and the religious aspects of missionaries, etc., of putting forth values. But can you tell us a little bit about that research on colonialism, knowing too that you probably are not quite yet deep into it because it's coming in the future?
Well, I don't remember quite whether it was the same scholar that spoke to me about intersectionality that said to me, until you get to colonialism, you will not have explored all of the root causes of violence and discrimination and stigma surrounding sexual orientation and gender identity. There are different ways to actually enter that area of study. You can just take the element of evidence that as of today, there's 69 countries that still maintain criminalization of some forms of sexual orientation or gender identity. And in an overwhelming proportion, those criminalizing laws were imposed by colonial processes. Typically, most typically, or most recently perhaps, by the extension of so-called Section 377 throughout the British Empire, for example, through which colonialism was installed in the Caribbean and is maintained as of today in 9 Caribbean countries in our hemisphere and in many other countries in Africa and Asia. Other deeper processes of colonialism will reveal themselves when you explore the colonialism through which Spanish and Portuguese Moors and religious and cultural Moors were exported to our hemisphere in the 1500s, and of course through different colonial processes affecting Asia, Africa, even Eastern Europe, and even within countries of the global north themselves. What is interesting about this is that once you begin to explore cultural tradition, you realize that respect, not only tolerance, but respect, deep respect for gender diversity has been a trait all throughout the world. And even in the presence of those processes, as of today, 1/3 of the world population lives in contexts in which gender diversity is protected by law or accepted by culture. And throughout the whole world, ancestral peoples such as the Mushe in Mexico, Hijra in India, Fafafine in the Pacific, and I could go on and on and on. Dozens and dozens of ancestral identities have recognized gender diversity as a fundamental part of the social fabric. It only comes when deeply, deeply structured processes defending, in particular, patriarchal structures get superimposed on those structures, and in very many cases violently imposed on those structures, that you see an undervalue, and in many cases an active criminalization and persecution of these models. So I'm interested in those processes. I'm interested in how colonialism superimposes values in a way where, as of today, political classes in many of those countries actually defend those models that were imposed by colonialism, recognize that they were imposed, but use them as an excuse not to decriminalize. The Savings Clause of the Caribbean, for example.
I appreciate so much you framing it in that way, as well as in identifying this is patriarchy that has suppressed then indigenous cultures in so many ways. With that, let's take the conversation briefly, because now we've been going for a while, but let's take the conversation to the initiative that you're working on with the Secretary General. It's the International Queer Youth Network, perhaps, that you're working on. And if you could talk about it in relation to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that would be very helpful.
Absolutely. Well, one of the foundational theories of my mandate is that we are working towards methodologies of social inclusion. That what we are seeking is to understand how LGBT persons are excluded from good education, or even education at all, health, housing, employment, and other areas, which are going to represent not only a hindrance to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, but of course a hindrance to the fulfillment of human potential of so many persons, which is of course what lies at the essence of the leave no one behind of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals thinking. And throughout the analysis of social indicators that have been worked by my mandate, analyzed by my mandate in using the methodologies developed, for example, by the UNDP and the World Bank and so many others that are working on these issues, I've become convinced that it will not be possible to not only guarantee, but to even ambition to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals unless you dismantle some of these deeply exclusionary structures that criminalization and stigma represent all throughout the world. Quick example. To know whether we achieve SDGs, we rely on data, right? Yes. How are you going to rely on data in contexts where you cannot really trust that people will tell you the truth about who they live with, or what their health problems are, or the realities and reasons why they are excluded from employment or did not get a housing loan or a rental? You will not be able to get that data, and you will therefore not be able to attack the reasons why exclusion and limitations are happening. So my theory is that in deconstructing those deeply exclusionary structures lies one of the keys to fulfillment of the SDGs. And I've been working systematically in analyzing those sectors. And when I was doing that, and I was doing my call for inputs, a number of youth-led and youth-serving LGBT organizations came forcefully to me and said, you will be making a huge mistake if you don't analyze these issues as also throughout the nuance of how the lived experiences changes, depending on whether you are a young person, even a child, a young person, a young adult, an adult, and an elder person. And they began to very actively make submissions to my work, Jill.
Yes.
Every report that I issued has had the input of dozens of organizations that are youth-led and youth-serving, and where I have been able to appreciate the texture of how these challenges manifest themselves in a completely specific way when you're talking about youth. So some examples might be immediately more evident to some people. Education is a sector where you can think of examples immediately. But it horrified me to find out throughout my research that where data is gathered, as many as 3 out of every 4 youth in situation of homelessness identifies as LGBT. That's 3 out of 4 where data is gathered. Systematic, different and inferior indicator performance in all of the sectors concerning SDG, and of course, integration to employment, and so on and so forth. Exactly. Even on the specifics such as COVID-19. So the Secretary General Special Envoy on Youth and myself have now launched an initiative to nurture the networks of youth-led and youth-serving organizations, and in particular, the Queer Youth Network. And we are following a program of different activities with the purpose of bringing visibility and hopefully ensuring that this network and the organizations that compose them will get proper support by political agencies and donor agencies to carry out their work.
Thank you very much. And we'll want to hear more about that, and particularly then that whole variable of youth-led initiatives, letting young people speak on behalf of themselves, for themselves. And Victor, it's great to hear that within all of your work and research, you are incorporating those voices. It's essential. With that, I'm going to move to our panelists at this point. Thank you very much, Victor. And we're going to hear from Monet Umana, who is from SMYAL, and SMYAL being in Washington, D.C., but also serving youth from Virginia and Maryland. Monet is a firm believer that in the root of everything, there should be a reverence for Black life. In her time with SMYAL, she was named the Youth Leadership Awardee for her work supporting LGBTQ+ youth who are addressing and challenged by homelessness. This award she did as part of her BA, bachelor's degree in urban studies. Monet is a youth development and community engagement fellow at SMYAL, working to create more culturally competent allies and to support queer youth so that they are thriving. Monet, we are thrilled to be able to have you today. Welcome. As we begin.
Hello, it's always that awkward moment where I'm trying to find the unmute button.
You've got it, you've got it. Let's begin by talking about who the young people are that SMYAL serves. Age, race, identity, living alone, living with others. Tell us about them, please.
Sure. So we have a really wide range of youth. As DC describes youth as young people between the ages of 13 and 24. And so we range. I'm so glad that Victor brought up the point about youth who are suffering from homelessness, because a lot of our most pressing needs have been youth who are suffering from homelessness. In the city, I believe it's about 39 to 40% of all youth who are suffering from homelessness are then queer. So I remember we also spoke to a little bit about intersectionality, the way that identities intersect. We find that a lot of those same youth who are queer, who are suffering from homelessness, are then Black or brown. So that kind of speaks the connectedness there. But in terms of who we serve, I was speaking a little bit to my own background. I'm actually from Maryland originally, was born in Baltimore and raised in Prince George's County. And so I found SMYAL just from a place of like being very alone, going to a predominantly white institution, not knowing where a comfort space for me would be. And SMYAL just walked into my life. Like I was saying a little bit earlier, I was a pretty hectic young person, needing a lot of mentorship and support. And I find that now being on the other side of that, now being a mentor to young people, I'm like seeing myself in youth like back to back all over the place, and loving that because I'm able to be the kind of person that I needed when I was younger. And so like finding that lost person, that person who wants to see Black queer adults in their life, and to know that, you know, it does get better, you do thrive, you live the life that you want to live, it's so affirming. So I hope that answers the question.
It certainly does. And tell me then what's, you know, within your role as Community Engagement Youth Leadership Fellow, what do you actually do?
Yes, that's a great question. It's also a question I had when I signed up for the position. Like, I was just excited to be around SMYAL and SMYAL's presence. And I was like, okay, what does this actually mean for me? So a lot of it is trainings. I'm currently, to speak to my work that I'm doing presently, I'm currently working on a workshop about decentering whiteness. So I think that in the past year, 2 years, for me, it was like around 2016, around the murder of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Tamir Rice. That was my kind of social awakening. But for young people today, you know, we're looking at Breonna Taylor, we're looking at George Floyd, and unfortunately, like countless other names that I could sit here and, you know, we could sit here for hours and talk about the ways that Black people have been murdered at the hands of the police. But there is like a social awakening going on for young people, especially young Black people. But I think also we've seen like young white people, even in the city, have kind of come to terms with the realities of their peers. So my work around decentering whiteness is less so looking at how white supremacy, how whiteness as a structure affects us, but more how we internalize it, right? And so things like straightening our hair, things like assimilating, things correcting our grammar, and not having reverence for these vernaculars that are like natural to us and come from our families and our histories, right? So thinking about those kinds of things, and I think that the conversation is especially poignant because as young people are looking to change the world around them, right, it all starts from within. And to also speak to that point that you brought up about, you know, Martin Luther King, and this injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? So like starting with the self and understanding how we have become these people who are receiving messages through media that we may not even be processing, that may be, you know, undercover or covert, and looking at how we can start with ourselves first. And especially, I think these are messages that young people need to be learning like ASAP, right? Like when you're coming up, of course. And so undoing it within yourself and then being able to see that reflected in the world. So that's a little bit about what I do.
Is that core of human rights, really, truly what you're speaking about is that core of it all starts from within. And absolutely, there are institutional barriers and also then individual prejudices, biases, and violence, but truly within as well. And so I'm thrilled to hear you talk in that way because I think it's so critical. With that, you know, you've talked about with the SDGs, SDG 10, as far as reduced inequalities, absolutely. You've talked about SDG 2, actually, which has to do with homelessness. Are there other SDGs that you see within this conversation that you believe that you're addressing within SMYAL? And we'll take your answer and then we'll move on to the next panelist.
Sure. So I think one way SMYAL as a collective works to apply those SDGs. I'm thinking one in terms of poverty, I'm thinking another in terms of education. A lot of what I do, I was talking about where SMYAL is located. We're located in Southeast Washington, D.C., which is home to some of the most impoverished communities in the city.
Yes.
And so we're seeing that a lot of, how do I put this? I'm trying to mince words here. A lot of what we see in our own communities, and I speak about our own communities because it's the community that I come from, right, are people, again, internalizing these things that on a greater scale, like whiteness, white supremacy has taught us about ourselves, right? That we're not smart, that we're not capable, that we cannot move beyond these barriers that are put in front of us. And so a lot of the work that, again, I do and SMYAL does as a collective is working to create more cultural competency, especially for organizations who want to come into our communities and better our experiences in the world. So for instance, when we're looking at like employers who would, in DC, who would seemingly like hire a cis presenting candidate over someone who they perceive to be trans, right? So like,
let's take a second to define cis so that everyone
knows. Yeah. So cis is short for cisgender, which is basically the antonym of transgender, right? So cisgender just means that you identify with the sex and thus the gender that you were identified at birth. Versus trans, which, you know, that prefix moving across would mean that you do not identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth.
Perfect. You were speaking about
so
employers.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're speaking about employers.
So someone who would perceive someone to be cisgender, or someone who perceives someone to be the same gender that they were assigned at birth, versus someone who they perceive to be trans, or someone who would identify as differently than how they were identified at birth. And so they would, there are many discrepancies that we see within like our youth, especially youth who are maybe aging out of our program, pursuing like longer term employment. And we find that there are so many huge barriers to employment, to living, to thriving in the city. And so we are working with Department of Health Services, different organizations in the city that are, I think Victor was also speaking to this data, who are getting this data on young people, and making it so that, you know, young people are not going to doctors and being laughed at for the experiences that they have, or, you know, trying to traverse this life and thriving in it, and being made to feel like they don't belong in the skin that they're in.
Thank you very much.
So I think that we hit a couple different things.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And really that whole thing of how to get to that place where every young person is thriving. And a lot of it is that whole variable of bringing in your whole self and being able to do that and finding ways to do that. So I very much appreciate your involvement with us. Let's take this now over to Zach. Zach, we've got you, and let me do an introduction of you, but I'm thrilled that you're with us. And it's important to say this bio is, you know, each of our bios are written by ourselves. So Zach, I love it how you begin your bio by saying Zach is an unapologetically politically involved high school senior for one more day. He currently serves as member of the Howard County Board of Education and the youth voice for the It Gets Better project. Zach ran for the Board of Education with a political vision and the goal of building inclusive community for all. Recently, he hosted a student voice panel for the Howard County Rainbow Conference, which was for high school youth and their families and supporters, and working with It Gets Better's project to present the South by Southwest Education 21 about inclusive curriculum mandates. In the fall, Zach will be attending the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in philosophy, politics, and economics. It all fits together. It's important to note that Zach is speaking as an individual and not on behalf of the Howard County Board of Education, not on behalf of the It Gets Better or South by Southwest, but Zach bring your whole self to this conversation. We are very glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. What drives you as an unapologetic political activist?
Yeah, I don't know who said this quote, but the personal is political. I grew up in Howard County Public Schools, which usually ranks within the top 5 of the best public school districts in the nation. And I'm very privileged to have this opportunity to go to like such an amazing school district, but that doesn't mean my like education was easy in any sense. I remember being bullied all through elementary school and pretty much my entire time in the public school system. It started with kids pulling at the edges of their eyes, trying to poke fun at me being an Asian student in a class that was predominantly white. Then those started turning into the F slur and other offensive remarks. And so I knew what that felt like. I struggled with depression for a long point in my life. And when I had the opportunity to make a difference, I said, well, you know what, I'll try, why not? Never expected to get this far. Ended up winning the Board of Ed seat, and I've served on the board since.
What does that mean to be on the Board of Ed? And we know you're not kind of representing that here, but can you just give us a little glimpse of your responsibilities as a board member?
Yes, so I am one of 8 board members. I have a vote that counts, a vote that matters. It's not just in name only, which is awesome. And so there have been points where we pass motions, whether school's gonna be open or closed, whether there's gonna be police in our hallways, and all the way down to the educational experience that affects students every day. A great example of that is this March, I made 2 motions, both which passed unanimously, to direct our superintendent to develop 2 new courses, a financial literacy course and an LGBTQ plus studies course, which would make us one of the first in the nation to offer a standardized LGBTQ plus studies course.
Absolutely. That definitely will put that school district on the map, and appreciate so much you sharing your own experience. When you think about these global SDGs, where do you think that we need to be making the most progress when it comes to LGBTQ youth, and what can we do to make things better?
Yeah, for me, I'm very focused on SDG 4 for education. That's where I find most of my advocacy, well, revolving around. That's what the advocacy I do with the It Gets Better project is around. But I would really emphasize ending poverty, because right now, as Victor said, and as Monet said, the poverty rates for LGBTQ youth are incredibly disproportionate to non-LGBTQ plus youth. And so, you know, you aren't going to be able to learn, you aren't going to be able to have an education that's effective and fair if you don't have a roof over your head. And so I think it starts with establishing housing for everyone and making sure that, you know, your everyday life isn't a stressor, that it's not a stressor to live your life as who you are.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. And tell us about this Rainbow Youth Conference. What happens there, and are you aware of other examples of this kind of conference happening elsewhere?
Yes, so it's our counties. This was always meant to be in person. However, the last 2 years, because of the pandemic, have been virtual, and it's a conference for youth from all across our middle and high schools to connect about their experience, to hear from amazing guest speakers. We've had our Maryland majority leaders speak at the conferences before, and many people globally and internationally speak. It's basically like a collective of GSAs, which are gender and sexuality alliances. Those are clubs usually at the high school level, or most prominently at the high school level, for students to talk about their shared experience, come together and basically offer this experience for students to learn, to connect. And it's not just only for LGBTQ plus youth. It's for youth who are questioning, who want to learn, for family members, for community members. And I know people from California who tuned into our own event.
Wow. And this certainly speaks to just the, silver lining, just a little bit of it of the pandemic, of allowing, in fact, that greater expansion of what is available and how we do that. Yeah. Yeah.
And
if you were to name 3 things that any adult could be doing to make things easier for LGBTQ youth, what would you say?
the first I would say is listen. I think it touches on intersectionality. Our experiences from person to person are so incredibly different. As a biracial second-gen queer person, my experience is very different from someone on halfway across the planet where being gay is a crime. And so, you know, listen to our stories. I would say empower and uplift. You know, give us those opportunities. Youth are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. It's probably best we start trying now and get our practice in. And so uplift our stories, connect us with other resources, I would say. Because, you know, no one person can speak on behalf of all LGBTQ plus youth. And so making sure that those options or those opportunities are intersectional. It's not just a white gay person who speaks about all the experiences of LGBTQ plus people. An activist, a friend of mine, said, don't speak on behalf, pass the mic. And I think that's what we have to do.
I like that. Don't speak behalf, pass the mic. I love it. All right, thank you very much, Zach. Appreciate it. And we'll get some interchange and we'll be taking questions in the chat box. So if you have a question that we'll deal with a little bit later for our panelists, please add that. We're going to move on now to our final panelist, and that is Kiera Johnson, Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force. Kiera joined the task force in 2018 as Deputy Executive Director. She was very engaged at that point already, but has worked with the Board of Directors and the National Action Council. She has served also with Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, URGE, as Executive Director, and so has a wealth of experience in organizational leadership, management, program development, youth leadership, and reproductive justice. As a bisexual Black woman, Johnson is one of a few out queer-identified women of color at the helm of a national LGBTQ organization. She's recognized as a national expert on queer and reproductive rights and has testified in front of the U.S. House of Representatives on the Equality Act, which we'll talk about in a bit. It has appeared in Newsweek, New York Times, Fox News, Feministing, and National Public Radio. That's like, what a contrast, you know? Fox News and Feministing. I mean, it's like, whoa. So, she serves as the Board of Directors of the General Service Foundation, the Groundswell Fund, and the Guttmacher Institute. Welcome, Kiera. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm super glad to be here.
Absolutely. You know, a moment ago, as Zach was talking about the Rainbow Conference and talking about families, you know, who are supporting, I wonder if we can start this conversation talking a little bit about, we have LGBTQ people. It's a portion of our population. They all have families. How does that all fit within this discussion as far as youth and how it all goes for LGBTQ youth and families?
I mean, I think it's what Zach said just a moment ago, right? As adults, right, who are connected, right, in all kinds of ways in our families, right, like as aunties and uncles and daughters and grandkids and parents, right, like we all have an opportunity to show up, right, and listen, uplift, and connect. And so if we think of, right, if we go into the work from a place of understanding that we are all connected, right, then anything that is about defending, right, LGBTQ people, supporting LGBTQ people is about all of us, right? We all have work to do, right? We all have a role to play, right? It's not somebody else's job to do it, right? Like it's our job to do it. So I guess it's important for us like to ask the questions, and I can't remember who said it, might be you, Monet, but talking about what do we need to do individually, right? So how do we start to unpack, right, and investigate our own biases, right? Like how do we start to unpack and start to neutralize and get up from under the biased and stereotypical, right, things we've learned, right? None of us got away from it, right? Like we all learned racist stuff. We all internalized homophobic stuff. We all internalized, right, things about whatever religion we're not a part of, right? It's not about not having that. It's about recognizing it, owning it, and then actively doing the work, right, to shift our behavior and to create policies and lived experiences for LGBTQ people and all of us who are connected to them, right?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's about taking action. And I think that often, in fact, there's that entire support system around a person who's LGBTQ. And that support system may be a biological family, it might not be. And as we've heard, as far as the situation of homelessness in youth, you know, that's a huge variable, and sometimes it's absolutely push out from family. For me, as a lesbian who has a daughter, her experience coming up, no, not as a lesbian child, but in fact as a child who was figuring out the world in her own way, was very, very important too, of who else is impacted. I mean, we are all a part of the same big environment and system, and so therefore homophobia impacts children too in that way, and how we do that.
Well, and you bring up, I think, a good point that often, you know, gets named, I think, a lot in LGBTQ space. We talk a lot about our adopted families, right? Our chosen families, right?
Yeah.
The reality is that family has never been a monolith, right? It's never been, right, like two parents, of, you know, dude and a girl and the two kids and the dog and the picket fence. That's just all like, it's all Nick at Night, right? TV, right? It's all like, it's fake news. And so if we know that it takes a village, right? We've all heard that term, probably all used that term, then where are the systems and policies and support to support the village, right? My mother, for example, raised 4 of her grandchildren, and there were lots of barriers, right, to what her getting the support she needed, right? So in addition to, right, like blood or biology, how do we create systems and policies and structures and financial support so that auntie, right, can be supported, so that community, right, can create not just a building where homeless youth can go, but like quality community, right? Like, you know, places where they are thriving, and there's arts and there's education and there's friends and there's fun and there's, right, like we've got to be thinking in an expansive way about what it means to support young people, right, and to give the support that all of us who are out here to support, right, we have the means to do that and do it well.
Absolutely, and policy does undergird that. Are there any policy initiatives that you're aware of right now that truly would make that difference for LGBTQ youth, so that in fact we could get to that place of truly getting closer to accomplishing the SDG goals of ending poverty and advancing education and so many other layers as far as gender and inequalities?
Well, one of the pieces of legislation that we're working on right now, and a lot of LGBTQ organizations are working on right now, is on the Equality Act, which is an expansion of civil rights for LGBTQ IA folk, but also for women and people of color in public accommodations, right? This is for me, right, this is such a, it's not the end all be all, and it's a critical example of where intersectional organizing, right, intersectional community work can be happening to further civil rights for all of us. And one of the barriers, I think, to this is a lot of people in the US think that there are already protections for LGBTQ people, right? They already they support it. And when they find out that actually you can lose your housing, right? If someone perceives that you're in a you know, a woman in a relationship with another woman trying to get a place. Now, you may or may not be queer, and it doesn't matter, because if they perceive it, they can deny you housing or kick you out, right? And so it's one of these things. There's an education piece that is like, you know, letting people know that actually the protections don't exist, number one, and two, to kind of shift this sense that everything is okay, right? Marriage passed, you know, we see queer people on TV, we see, right, you know, we see drag queens in their own show, we've got Pose, we've got, right, we had a gay man run for president, and people are like, we've totally broken that ceiling. Guess what? No, we haven't broken that ceiling, right? We've come a long way, and that's to be celebrated. But the reality is, for us to get to liberation, for us to get to equity, for us to get to thriving, for us to not see Black trans women dying on the streets every damn week, we've got a long way to go. And so the Equality Act, at least for us, is one step in that direction. And Lord knows we've got a lot more to do federally, but also at a state level as well.
Absolutely. And from my understanding of the Equality Act, really there are 39 states where there's not protection as far as, for example, employment and employment discrimination and or losing your job because of that.
It's true. I mean, and again, I don't want to give the sense that that is the end, right? The 40% of women in this country identify as lesbian, bisexual, or queer, for example, right? 40% of the women in prison, right, are our people, right? And many states across the country are denying people who are coming out of prison the right to vote, right? So that is another example of, right, where we have work to do. We are being denied this right to participate in our democracy even after a sentence is served, right? So access to our democracy, right, is another place where we've got to do some work, right? What does that mean for us, you know, sitting in these intersectional identities, right? And using these platforms that we're in to do that intersectional work.
Absolutely. And with that, of course, voting rights and the curtailment of voting rights, as we have seen in so many ways. Absolutely. Also, I will mention, we'll make sure that we send information out to everyone who's on this Zoom about the Equality Act so that they can add their voices to it. Since it is in the Senate now, it went through and successfully made it out of the House of Representatives in February. Coming in June, in fact, is another piece of legislation in the United States Congress. It is yet to be introduced, but it is coming. We're in June now, so get ready, which is in fact the act, which is not named yet by number, but to protect human rights and enhance opportunities for LGBTQI people around the world and for other purposes. This really will help equip our United States government as it does interactions with all of the nations of the world, but especially then those 70 nations where it continues to be, you know, to be a homosexual is still to be illegal, and or what is termed illegal and illegal behavior. I'm going to pass this back over to Victor. You've been listening then to three different people who have talked about that local variable and then the national variable of where we land and where we sit. What have you heard and how does it relate to your work as an independent expert?
I think one of the fundamental lessons that you learn in a position such as the one that I have the honor to carry out is that there needs to be the right mix of energies flowing in the same direction for sustainable and durable change to take place. Everybody in this panel has been talking about different ways in which change is effectuated, but the one thing that I think we were all underlining is that it needs to be done by the people for whom it matters, and it matters deeply. So I am very pleased to hear when states, governments around the world talk about the idea of building coalitions and respecting the opinion of local human rights defenders in how to move things forward. I think one of the fundamentals of success in a world free of criminalization by 2030, which is one of the calls that I've made to the international community, would be if there is a significant coalition of forces that can basically exist around this objective of having everyone in the world live free and equal and free from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That will not happen if it's imposed from the international perspective. It needs to happen at all of these levels that we're talking about. And clearly, one of the messages that is, to me, very evident is youth needs to be a part of it, given clearly that we are very much hoping that these are the leaderships that are going to be claiming empowerment over the next 20 years. Change needs to happen from that angle as well.
Very much appreciated. And that youth involvement, youth empowerment piece is so built into and cooked into SMYAL, for example, that's so very important. And with that, perhaps, Victor, you've got questions or things that you want to follow further on as far as with our panelists. Certainly, we know that the Equality Act and policy, the undergirding of policy is so very important. Maybe too, you could talk about places where you think there are very good policies that are happening in other nations that might be models for us also.
Well, let me give you an example, because my business, so to speak, is to identify good public policy, good legislation, good measures of access to justice. So I could go on and on forever, but I'm going to give you an example. When COVID-19 hit us, all of us, I don't believe that anybody was quite as prepared as we all needed to be for it. And so I amongst them, I put the mandate in a listening pattern. I was a bit disconcerted about what the mandate should do in a situation where I could not go and meet with people and interview victims and carry out country visits and this and that and so forth. And I put the mandate in a listening pattern and eventually had a conversation that included over 1,000 individuals from over 100 countries. And what I can tell you is that good public policy, in my view, has usually follows six fundamental principles that I have coined under the acronym of ASPIRE. And it's what I issued as the ASPIRE guidelines for good COVID response and recovery. ASPIRE answers to acknowledge that LGBT people are everywhere and they must be part of response and recovery. Support LGBT-led and LGBT-serving organizations. Protect LGBT human rights defenders from persecution in the context of emergency measures. Recognize that indirect discrimination is a risk. That's the I. It's a little bit convoluted. Indirect discrimination. Representation is key. Stakeholders need not only be interviewed, they need to be represented in the processes of design and implementation. And finally, evidence-based approaches must be taken, substituting prejudice and stigma-based approach. Typically, if you don't have evidence, what you will do is you will be acting on your prejudice. You need to abandon that. And so ASPIRE guidelines were something that I issued in June of last year to the community of nations, and surrounding which a number of states have actually presented information about the measures that were taken, and also that I've used to examine bad practice all around the world in relation to COVID-19 response and recovery. So if you follow those principles, in my view, you're pretty close to getting to how good public policy is made.
Thank you very much. Certainly Aspire gives us good guidelines that any organization or individual can go for as we look at this. And what we know is that with the COVID-19 crisis, which absolutely is on fire in other nations, even though we are on the downturn here, it is those who are most vulnerable across societies who are the most impacted. And we must keep that in mind in the process. So I'm glad to get the Aspire reference, Victor. I think that's very valuable for us. I'm going to pass it over now to Ryan Oberlog. First off, if you have questions for the panelists, please go ahead and put it in the chat box. And then Ryan has been watching and keeping an eye on things, and he will go ahead and pose some questions in for our speaker and panelists. Go for it, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Jill, and thank you very much, panelists. So as Jill said, I've kind of been monitoring the chat since we've started, and there's been some questions, but if there's more questions that anyone else here has for any of our panelists, go ahead and ask them. But for our first question, I'm going to start off with Victor again here. Someone earlier in the chat, I believe it was Portia, she had mentioned something about queer persecution in Uganda because they were staying at COVID. They were staying at an LGBTQ homeless shelter, and they were arrested on the grounds of disregarding COVID guidelines. And then Pukar from Nepal also asked something similar for COVID-19. They said that in light of the disproportionate impact on COVID-19 on LGBTIQ plus people, what are your specific plans to ensure that issues faced by LGBTQ plus people are represented and their issues are centered and prioritized, and affirmative actions are instituted within the UN system, just like they are for any other minority groups?
Wow, that's a complete set of questions. So let me try and give you a couple of examples, and then we can, of course, I'm always happy to continue conversations as we continue this long work of addressing violence and discrimination. So I think the Aspire framework was the result of an understanding of how important it was to get the voices of LGBT people, and within LGBT people, the different identities and cross-identities, including, of course, as Monet was mentioning, the very significant points of intersection with race. We know that LGBT people did not come to the pandemic on a level playing field. They already came behind, and the pandemic basically exacerbated that situation of inequality and vulnerability. Let me give you 3 or 4 examples, and then I'll move on quickly to the rest of the question. For example, trans women all over the world, but very much in Global South, rely disproportionately on sex work for income for many reasons that are complex social factors. That means typically that they will not have big savings accounts, but also because in most countries they don't have access to legal recognition of gender identity. It also means that they don't have access to credit. It probably means that they have precarious relationships with landlords. One example of a good practice that I was very pleased to see is that Argentina, the day that the pandemic was declared, a few days later, it declared a moratorium on evictions affecting trans women. Immediately, because the government, through speaking with trans women, knew that it was going to be a question of 24 hours after a quarantine and a curfew was decreed, that trans women would not have enough money to actually pay for their lodgement, which they paid for on a day-by-day basis. So there you go as an example in how to carry out these examples. What I do, Ryan, in my work is that I bring all of this evidence into a reporting mechanism. I present a report yearly to the General Assembly of the UN, and I report to the Human Rights Council. And hopefully what I can do is give visibility to the way that violence and discrimination manifest themselves so that others can actually take stock and take action, including within the UN family. And a large part of the evidence body that I gathered relates to SDG furtherance. As I say, a large part of the evidence base available to my mandate is, unless you deconstruct those deeply discriminatory and excluding structures, we have no hope of meeting any of the SDGs. And of course, that's from my vantage point. I'm sure, and I know for a fact, that there are other vantage points where this is really the situation. So it all depends on deep exercises of eliminating discrimination and violence as systemic manifestations.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Great responses, great. I think that our next question, we're gonna move on to Kiera. There was a question from Portia from Tanzania, I believe she said earlier in the chat. And her question was, with the task force having a national focus, is there any work overseas that the National Task Force does specifically with African countries? And what would that partnership look like if there is?
We actually only work domestically. We don't have any international partnerships right now, which is really unfortunate. And the one place where we have an opportunity that already exists is we have an annual conference called Creating Change. It is a ginormous political, cultural family reunion of LGBTQ folks from all over, right? It started as a domestic place for LGBTQ people to come together, right, and have community, but also get skills building trainings and networking and learning about trends and philanthropy and what was happening in organizing on the ground in various states. But it has grown over the years, and we've had delegations from different places around the world, and that is about the extent of our international work. What I will say is that the conference and the organization itself has started to evolve and transition to being less English focused, US focused, and has really expanded our language access. So more of our conference is being done in multiple languages, in addition to just general more accessibility. So I think there maybe some of the other panelists can talk more about specific partnerships in other countries, but I also just wanted to say to the previous question that research matters, right? And data matters. And one of the things that I hear over and over again, right, whether it is what is the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTQ folks? What is the unique experience of LGBTQ folks who are walking into health centers, right? Sexual health centers, reproductive health centers. And what I hear over and over and over again is we don't have the data. We don't have the data. We don't have the data, right? And so, some of the most important work and organizing we can do is to demand that we get counted, right? And it's not necessarily sexy all the time, right? But it can be done. One of the task force, it took us like a decade to figure it out, but we had a whole census campaign, right? It was called Queering the Census, right? And it was, for years, it was just education about what is the census, where does the money go, how do we access it, right? And it was through the education pieces that we were able to communicate, right, the impact of the billions of dollars that the census, define, right? It designates where these monies go, right? COVID relief funds, homeless shelters, HIV/AIDS treatments, right? Like the census dictates that. And if we're not counted, right? If they don't know that we're here, right, in all of our rainbowness, it affects where those monies go and whether or not we have access to it. So it's a plug to like get, you know, make that ask, make those demands, create those kinds of campaigns that make us visible, right? Like, where is our checkbox, or where are all of our boxes, right? Like, how do we, right, get named on our driver's license? How do we show up, right, when we're filling out a form, when we're applying for a job, or applying for, you know, financial support, or applying, you know, we've got to be named more explicitly if we're really going to see the results of what that data means for us.
Yeah, very important. And thank you for speaking about data collection, because that was one of my personal questions that I had whenever I was kind of listening to everyone speak earlier. So very important. And thank you, Emma, for putting in Creating Change and Queering the Census links there so everyone can go check that out. And then I guess I'll kind of move on to Shayna's question here, which was geared towards all panelists, but I'm going to start with Zach, just kind of being the future of activists and advocates. But at this moment, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is youth. Seeing so many people become beyond what I would call Instagram activism, posting a black square as it, you know, thinking that'll create substantial change, but seeing people get involved. You know, I remember, you know, seeing people's Instagrams about their friends, and now they're posting about, here's how you can respect someone's pronouns. Here's how you can respect someone's identity. And so with the millions of people who marched last June and continue to do so, with Pride Month starting today, I think the young people's ability to quickly adapt in technology that connects us all throughout the globe to resources. And I think that actually ties back to sustainable developmental goal about, you know, who has access and who doesn't. And so technology right there. But, you know, the youth is certainly, I think, what inspires me, and it's about acceptance and not tolerance, is I think a big point.
And then Monet, if you would like to speak on that as well, what gives you hope, especially being here in the DC area, maybe what gives you hope for the DMV?
For sure. Of course, you know, my first thought is someone who works with like young people and like pushes young people, pushes organizations to better serve young people. Like, of course, my first answer was young people, right? Of course, like same page as Zach, like it's young people. But I think when I think a little bit more critically about it, I forget who mentioned it. We were talking about like chosen family, right? Like this idea of community. And I think it's specifically working with like young queer people, young Black queer people. A lot of our families are the people that we choose. And so I think that like seeing community building happening, especially during the pandemic, right? When so many people are suffering with these ideas of like isolation, not really knowing where to turn to. A lot of programs had to turn to online. So we really have to deal with that. But I really love the fact that so many young people are coming to their own spaces, find people who love them, who support them unconditionally, and who want to see them, like, I feel like this is the buzzword of today, but who want to see them thrive, you know? So it's so beautiful to see that. And it gives me so much hope about what's to come in the future. I went to protests all summer, masked up, of course, but all summer. And it's crazy, we're back on a summer again, but last summer. And to see my people like singing and rejoicing and just celebrating that we have life. And, you know, though people want to snuff it out so badly, we still have it. It was amazing. So that's something that's definitely bringing me hope that I'm carrying into this summer, this Pride Month. And I hope that you all carry it with me.
Wonderful words. We all need a little bit of love, I think. So I think we'll go over to Kiera, and then Victor, if you want to finish off with what gives you hope.
I love hope questions so much. I am originally from Georgia, very South Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm a Southern girl through and through. And what gives me hope is all of the queer coming out and activism that is happening in the so-called Bible Belt, Rust Belt, in these places where people assume that we're not, right? And they assume, right, that we are not being creative and being unapologetic. And so, you know, queer religious people, right? Southern Baptists and Mormons, right, out of Utah, folks in the middle of the country in Oklahoma and Alabama and the Dakotas, right? Like it is, we are a force to be reckoned with, and it across age, across political spectrum, it is going to be, we are an undeniable force, right? And soon, I truly believe we are going to be able to leverage real political power, right? To shift our communities. And when I say communities, I mean communities with an S, right? For the betterment of LGBTQ people, but for the betterment, right, of Black folks, for the betterment of API folks, for the betterment of Indigenous folks and Latinx folks, right, for the betterment of youth and homeless and broke, poor, working class people, right? Like that is who we are, right? That's who's staring at you in the face, right? And we're not just on the coasts. And the more I hear, right, about that activism and I see it and I get to engage with it, I know it's not an if, it's a when, right? We're gonna shift the tide. I believe that.
Thank you. And then Victor, what gives you hope?
Well, I have the enormous privilege of being in a position that allows me to see so much courage around the world and so many stories of people who refuse to actually let the current conditions under which they live determine who they are going to be. As many of you know, today marks a number of days that 21 persons were arrested in Ghana. They were basically just exercising their freedom of association. People are under that threat, as we said, in 69 countries around the world. And in very many others, their existences are actually used to score political points. And unfortunately, there's no country in the world that is where these narratives are absent. I'm deeply concerned, for example, of processes that seem to so violently question the right of trans persons and trans youth in so many countries around the world, and not least in our hemisphere and countries these days. But in face of that, there is such remarkable resilience and such remarkable resistance that it would be insulting not to have hope. Because if those that are dealing with those challenges have hope and act on their hope and refuse to let themselves down, then I certainly don't believe that I can do otherwise.
Wonderful words there to kind of close us out. I think, Jill, if you would like to say something a little bit, and then we'll kind of close out here. But yeah, wonderful words from all the panelists tonight.
Thank you so much, Ryan. You know, throughout this, there have been incredibly rich links that have been in the chat. Make sure that you save the chat and take your time afterwards as far as going through. Panelists, your words, bringing your whole selves to this conversation has been so very powerful. Thank you very, very much. I also want to very much thank Ryan. Also, Ed Elmendorf, we've not heard from, who is actually part of that link that brought us connection to Victor Marigra Borlos. He's a former president of UNA-NCA. Also then Anna Gabar, Natalia de Gravel, who were helped in the process of putting this together with the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. All of us work in this together. And it strikes me that we all can be allies, whether it is in fact someone who is not LGBTQ and being an ally in that way, or then an ally on race issues and on religious intolerance issues in so many ways. We have work to do. So to start with the words of Victor, resilience and resistance, and also that we all need and keep a vision of what can be better. That's the core of ensuring and making sure we make human rights real. Let me quickly mention, just real quick, membership in the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area is free for anyone who's under 25. Pass on the word. And for those of you who are 25 and older, we want you, we need you, because we know that together we can address all of the cross-cutting issues of our humanity. It's not just, international relations, State Department nerds, but in fact, all of us that make that difference. So join us, join a committee, get involved. We would love to get acquainted. I end with the words of Audre Lorde, African-American, American, feminist, and lesbian, whose life ended all too short. And she said, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. We're all in this together, global to local, and each one of our speakers today, Victor, Monet, Zach, and Kiera, helped make that point so true. So thanks so much for joining us and joining the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. Have a great afternoon, and it's Pride. See what else you can do to get involved.